In July 2023, U.S. President Joe Biden sounded certain when he talked about Ukraine joining the NATO family. One day, he said, it would happen, but not yet. He wouldn't even give a timeline, much to the chagrin of the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. But what if Mr. Biden's promise was made up of about 85% hot air? That's what some political pundits say. They say there's a reason for this absence of a timeline because it won't happen at all. Or at least they say it won't happen anytime soon. Whether Ukraine wins the war or not, there's too much at stake, they say. Joe Biden might be well into his post-presidentship retirement when Ukraine is finally accepted into the gang, but even that's not certain. What if the risks are just too big? And what if the US and some other leading powers are actually quite content with how things stand, despite their upbeat rhetoric about a possible new addition to this happy defensive family? This is what we'll explore today. While some countries have been calling for Ukraine to join NATO through an expedited process, especially Eastern European ones, others are hesitant. After all, in the world of balance of power politics, every country is out for itself. Strategically, they must play their cards right. For some, Ukraine joining NATO improves their hand, but for others, not so much. If this sounds vague, you'll understand what this means soon. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was established in 1949 with three goals in mind: deter Soviet expansionism, stop nationalist militarism on the European continent, in part thanks to a North American presence, and encourage political integration of European countries. The establishment of NATO on paper was for the greater good of mankind. The first members were the US, UK, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, France, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, and Portugal. What's important today is Article 5 of the treaty. It states that any attack on a NATO member in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. NATO can then take, quote, action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. In short, NATO policy says, we've got your back. That's a promise, not a maybe. We should just add that NATO has its sights set on expanding to the Asia-Pacific region, so the treaty might have to be updated at some point. It would become evident in this show why NATO is opening its giant arms far from the North Atlantic. It's got something to do with the C word, the big C, and we don't mean cancer or bleep. NATO is not supposed to be an aggressive alliance, it's a defensive alliance, at least on paper. Paper that some NATO critics say isn't, as the expression goes, good enough to wipe your backside with. The so-called family has its fair share of skeptics, including Noam Chomsky, an outspoken critic of U.S. foreign policy over the years. He recently called NATO the most violent, aggressive alliance in the world, and when he said that, he was talking about Ukraine joining NATO. Chomsky cited NATO military activity in Serbia, Iraq, and Libya as examples of NATO aggression. He said you could hardly call NATO's military actions in those countries a matter of peacekeeping. We'll later discuss Chomsky's recent and controversial conversation with the famed political activist and whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, a man who in that same conversation said the highly frictious words, "NATO is our Cosa Nostra," what the mafia call our thing. These comments from the two highly divisive scholars are important in relation to this video. Whether you resolutely support them or vehemently oppose them, we think their arguments about Ukraine and NATO are interesting. Another controversial character who has talked critically about NATO is the political scientist John Mearsheimer. He's what's called a political realist. Today's Ukraine won't join NATO video is mostly a realist argument, so it would be helpful for you to know something about political realism. Mearsheimer has written a lot about war, the balance of power in the world, and why countries do what countries do when trying to preserve or bolster their national security. Notably in his book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, in which he tries to show through his realist theories why great powers acted the way they did when wars broke out, or they started wars, or they covertly or overtly undermined or attacked another state. Mearsheimer has written that the USA will do whatever it takes to remain the world's sole superpower, whether that means starting wars, encouraging other countries to fight wars, standing back, or offering support while not sending in troops. In relation to this, in 2015, he predicted the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path, and the end result is that Ukraine is going to get wrecked. Mearsheimer's military theory is like a real-life game of Risk. Countries will do anything to maintain their power in the realist's might is right world. He's an offensive realist, not a defensive realist, which means he holds a skeptical view and frankly depressing view that means countries assume other countries have the worst intentions. That's why they're stuck in an endless cycle of aggression. It's also why Mearsheimer doesn't believe in China's so-called peaceful rise as a great power, just as many in higher echelons of the US government don't. Offensive realists believe countries will actively pursue security through domination and hegemony, whereas defensive realists say countries will act more reserved while trying to maintain their security. Good or bad doesn't often come into it, despite the rhetoric often heard in the media or from politicians' mouths. Example, as a supposed bastion of liberal democracy in the world during the Cold War, the US helped overthrow democratically elected leaders around the globe to replace them with tyrants who committed terrifying human rights abuses and, in some cases, mass slaughter of civilians. Just recently, a US politician said, "If we abandon Ukraine to the dark forces of autocracy, we will pay a price." The US has abandoned plenty of countries to dark autocracies in the past in the name of protecting its power. This is important in regard to today's rather skeptical video. Mearsheimer might still argue that the US is the best country in the world to have as the sole superpower. It's not pretty, great power politics. It never was. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. The US wears the crown, but not through being nice. Bear this in mind as we go through the upcoming arguments. We'll often speak about China in this show, even though China isn't actively or overtly involved in the Ukrainian war. China, says Mearsheimer, is heading in the direction of war with the US. Like the US, it wants to preserve its power through domination and hegemony. China wants the crown, and it too will go to any lengths to get it, at least according to the offensive realist theory. Weakness, realists say, can lead to other countries taking advantage of you, like the UK, US, France, Russia, and Japan did when China was weak, and it endured what is now referred to as the century of humiliation. China got the poop kicked out of it, and it took a long time until it got back on its feet. Let this serve as an example of what can happen when a country's military is weak. Mearsheimer believes that China is seeking to become the regional hegemon in Asia, which the US certainly doesn't want. Therefore, the US might be drawn into conflicts when trying to protect its Asian allies. In short, Mearsheimer says, an intense security competition with considerable potential for war will take place between the US and China. This show is about Ukraine joining NATO, but China matters. It matters a lot. Mearsheimer made himself vastly unpopular with a large part of the American populace when, at the start of the Ukraine war, he believed Russia's invasion on the United States and its European allies, stating Putin was in the wrong, but that the US and its allies had pushed Russia too far. What did he mean by that? As you know, NATO was not disbanded when its main threat and main reason for its existence, the Soviet Union, no longer existed. When Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev was dismantling the Soviet Union, he sought assurances that NATO would not expand eastward. He wanted security measures in place for Russia. He believed the expansion of NATO would directly threaten Russia, while the West thought Russia would still pose a possible threat in Europe. In fact, Gorbachev wanted Russia to join NATO in 1990, telling U.S. Secretary of State James Baker, "You say that NATO is not directed against us, that it is simply a security structure that is adapting to new realities. Therefore, we propose to join NATO." Declassified British files show how Russia's next president Boris Yeltsin also proposed it, according to a statement made by the British Defense Secretary Malcolm Rifkind. George Robertson, who was the former British Defense Secretary who led NATO between 1999 and 2003, said Putin in his early days also wanted to join NATO. Robertson said a combination between him and Putin went like this: Putin, when are you going to invite us to join NATO? Robertson, well, we don't invite people to join NATO, they apply to join NATO. Putin, well, we're not standing in line with a lot of countries that don't matter. These were the days when Western politicians and Western media looked quite favorably upon Putin when he said things such as, "I cannot imagine my own country in isolation from Europe," and what we often call the civilized world. In the year 2000, an article in New York Times Magazine called Putin a humane version of Peter the Great, a ruler who will open the country to influence of the world at once, gentler and more dynamic than Russia has ever been. He was called utterly professional in the same article. President Clinton said he was a man he can do business with. President Bush later said, "I looked the man in the eye. I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul." Now let's get back to NATO expanding eastward. Jack Matlock, who was the U.S. ambassador to Moscow from 1987 to the fall of the Soviet Union, said that categorical assurances were made that NATO wouldn't expand to the east. Declassified documents found in the National Security Archive at George Washington University show U.S., Soviet, German, British, and French diplomats had all talked about the expansion of NATO in the eastward direction, stating that Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic's joining NATO should be off the table. NATO expansion, they said, would be perceived as aggression that could lead to bloody conflict between the two largest nuclear powers. In March 1991, British Prime Minister John Major made the assurance while visiting Moscow that nothing of the sort will happen. Notably, none of this was legally binding. They were words, not signed documents. Still, in January 1990, German Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher proposed that NATO issue a statement saying, "There will be no expansion of NATO territory to the east and closer to the borders of the Soviet Union." In February, Genscher said, "For us it is a certainty that NATO will not expand to the east, and that applies generally." A now declassified memorandum shows that James Baker offered ironclad guarantees that NATO's jurisdiction or forces would not move eastward. When Gorbachev said that NATO expansion was unacceptable, Baker replied, "We agree with that." Baker again said it is important for the Soviet Union and other European countries to have guarantees that if the United States maintains its presence in Germany within the framework of NATO, there will be no extension of NATO's jurisdiction or military presence by a single inch in the eastern direction. But were they talking about east as in East Germany, not the whole of Europe? That's still debated, but many politicians and security analysts over the years and in the US and the rest of the West have warned about NATO expansion eastward. It's not a secret. The Guardian wrote in 2022, "It has long been clear that NATO expansion would lead to tragedy. We are now paying the price for the US's arrogance." Joe Biden's CIA Director William J. Burns warned about such provocation many times, saying it would turn out very badly. In 2008, when he was then the American ambassador to Moscow, he wrote to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice saying, "Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests." He added, "Russia will respond. Russian-Ukrainian relations will go into a deep freeze. It will create fertile soil for Russian meddling in Crimea and eastern Ukraine." In a meeting with Putin, Burns was told Ukraine in NATO would be a hostile act toward Russia. "We would do all in our power to prevent it." Earlier in 1997, 50 well-known foreign policy experts signed an open letter to President Bill Clinton saying something similar. "We believe that the current US-led effort to expand NATO is a policy error of historic proportions that will unsettle European stability." There may not have been a formal agreement not to expand NATO, but was expansion the right idea? The controversial people whose arguments we're talking about today say no, it wasn't, just as Burns said. Interestingly, Salon in 2023 said Burns should use his considerable expertise in Russian affairs to help negotiate an end to this brutal and unwinnable war. The writer then asked, would that make him a Putin apologist or a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize? As you'll later see, Americans are divided about the Ukraine war and Ukraine joining NATO, much because of the things you'll hear in this video. Of course, NATO did expand eastward. It expanded a lot through its open door policy, but so far not as far as Ukraine. On March 12, 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined NATO. On March 29, 2004, NATO welcomed Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Albania and Croatia joined in 2009, Montenegro in 2017, Macedonia joined in 2020, Finland was the last sign-up in 2023, Sweden will be next. Let's now go back to April 2008 at the NATO summit in Bucharest, when NATO issued a statement saying Ukraine and Georgia would also soon become part of the NATO family. According to Mr. Mearsheimer, Russia saw this as an existential threat. Remember, Mearsheimer's way of thinking is related to his theory of great power politics, in which countries act offensively to weaken others. For Russia, NATO expansion and turning Ukraine into a pro-American liberal democracy was a direct threat to the existence of Russia. If Ukraine joining NATO is an existential threat to Russia, then what we might have on the table is two of the world's most powerful nuclear powers one day going to war. Remember, under Article 5, the US would have to support Ukraine militarily if it were invaded. And if being in NATO really is a threat to Russia's existence, then what would Russia do if this became a reality? That's the big question. We'll come back to it soon. Many political scientists weren't surprised that at the NATO summit in Vilnius, Lithuania, in July 2023, no timeline was put forward for Ukraine to join NATO. President Zelensky was not content with the results of the summit, going as far as to release a signed declaration saying Ukraine's future is in NATO. That wasn't good enough. Zelensky wanted a timeline. Zelensky, it seemed, had had enough of promises. He needed a date on his calendar to mark with an X. He He wrote on Twitter, "It's unprecedented and absurd when a time frame is not set, neither for the invitation nor for Ukraine's membership." He had every right to say that. Why all this one day and someday talk? Why not say something more solid? Well, the argument being put forward in this show is it's because it's not going to happen. Let's now talk more about why. In terms of world powers, who is the USA's biggest competitor? It's certainly not Russia, not even close. It's China. In realist logic, the US should be preparing for a war with China, so it doesn't want to put itself in a position where a direct war with Russia becomes a possibility. Recently, we've seen the mountain of resources it takes to fight a modern land war in Ukraine. Even if things didn't get nuclear with a possible US-Russian war, does the US want to expend so much of its money, resources, and soldiers in a European war when China is militarily growing in size, becoming bigger and bigger of a threat? If Ukraine were in NATO, the US would have no choice but to help Ukraine. All of this would only help China. In a game of Risk, what would you do if you were playing as the US and you wanted to remain the world's only superpower? Would you expend so much of your resources in Europe as China bolsters its military? Would you gamble a nuclear war with Russia, a country that may believe its very survival is at risk? Ukraine could even win the war, and it still wouldn't get into NATO, not for the foreseeable future, at least according to the theories posited in the show today. Even if it was the case, it's unlikely that the war in Ukraine will be over soon and Ukraine will walk away victorious. We have no evidence that tells us that that's going to happen in the next few months. In November, 5 months after Ukraine's counteroffensive began, the country had only advanced about 17 kilometers. Ukraine's commander-in-chief, General Valery Zaluzhny, said, "Just like in the First World War, we have reached the level of technology that puts us into a stalemate. There will most likely be no deep and beautiful breakthrough." Ukraine has made some impressive gains throughout the war, much in part because of support from other nations, notably the $100 billion or so from the US. Perhaps with more weapons, Ukraine could break the stalemate, especially as Russia might have lost in the region of 315,000 troops. Russia is piling money into its arms industry, employing more and more people in its factories, but it's losing men and equipment at a staggering rate. The US has been able to watch from a distance as Russia becomes weaker and weaker. There's been growing criticism regarding the money being pumped into Ukraine, and there has been a change in how Americans support the war because of it. Still, maybe the US's objective has now been met, to substantially weaken Russia. If this was really the objective all along, as many people are now saying, what would be the point of inviting Ukraine into NATO? Think about that in realist terms. From a US, UK, French, or German perspective, do they really want to risk the possibility of all-out war breaking out in Europe, one that could also become nuclear? What would Russia, on its last legs facing an existential threat, do? This is a country with the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. Even if for some reason it just conceded the war in Ukraine, which it won't, it would still have its nuclear arsenal to fall back on. The continent would still be under a serious threat. That's why, back in the day, both former French President Nicolas Sarkozy and former German Chancellor Angela Merkel aired the criticism of George W. Bush's plan to bring Ukraine into the NATO family. Merkel said Russia would see it as a declaration of war. Russia still sees it as a declaration of war. In 2023, Vladimir Putin called Ukraine in NATO a mortal threat to Russia. Here's part of his speech. During the years that followed the breakup of the Soviet Union, the West never stopped trying to set the post-Soviet states on fire, and most importantly finish off Russia as the largest surviving portion of the historical reaches of our state. He said the West, namely the US, wants one thing: Russia's strategic defeat. He added, "What does this mean to us? This means they plan to finish us once and for all." You might not agree with this, of course, and like any politician, Putin is a master of rhetoric and a major producer of propaganda. But is he right about the West wanting to weaken his nation to the point of catastrophic failure? According to Mearsheimer, Putin's goal is not to take over Ukraine, but to do enough damage and have enough territory in the east of the country to turn Ukraine into a rump state, a shadow of itself which will render it less of a threat to Russia, but importantly make it so it wouldn't be able to qualify for NATO membership. A chaotic bust-up state will not get into NATO. Putin is thinking this, according to Mearsheimer. We can't stress enough that Mr. Mearsheimer's words are very contentious, but it seems like his theory has gained a bit of traction. Many Western military and political experts have talked about the red lines that can't be crossed, which will set off catastrophic events humanity won't easily recover from. Ukraine joining NATO seems to be one of those lines. Now back to Noam Chomsky and the 2023 interview he shared with the Pentagon Papers publisher Daniel Ellsberg. in which Chomsky said he believes we might be sleepwalking toward a nuclear apocalypse. He said in that interview, the Ukraine war has been regularly described as a proxy war between Russia and the United States over Ukrainian bodies. It's getting harder and harder to pretend that that's not what's happening. He believes that if no side can back down, if there's no diplomatic solution, we could head toward species extinction. Ellsberg said the same, that with Ukraine in NATO, the US would have to join the war. A war, he said, which could mean a nuclear winter on the horizon and the world as we know it ending. He explained, I would say every person in the world has a stake in preventing that from happening, and that means persuading the US to continue what Biden is saying so far at least, not to send F-16s and American fighters of various kinds into the war to threaten Putin and to trigger him, possibly to carry out these threats, which I think should be recognized by everyone in the world as monstrous, insane, immoral. Ellsberg reminded us of the words of George F. Kennan, once ambassador to the Soviet Union, sometimes called the architect of post-World War II U.S. strategy of Soviet containment. In 1996, in an article Kennan wrote for the New York Times, he said, expanding NATO would be the most fateful error of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. He thought it was very similar to an invasion, or at least that's how it would be perceived. He also said, I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think that it's a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. Ellsberg explained that in this situation, I believe that Putin would very likely carry out his threat to initiate tactical nuclear war, at least with obviously a very great danger, even a probability, a high priority of escalating to an all-out war. Ellsberg added that a land war between the US and Russia would not end in a stalemate like other US wars. It would not peter out like Afghanistan or end with something like what happened in Vietnam. He thinks this would be the war to end all wars. He said, I would like to see individual members of NATO in Europe recognize now, for the first time, they are looking down the barrel of nuclear first-use threats. He believes that prior to the invasion, Putin had asked for signed assurances that Ukraine would not join NATO, referring to a meeting Putin and Zelensky had in Istanbul when the then Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett had acted as a mediator. They were apparently open to diplomatic solutions in that meeting, agreeing on territorial issues and Ukraine not joining NATO. Ellsberg explained, apparently there was an agreement which, according to the report, Boris Johnson of Britain flew to assure that if Zelensky made any such concessions or compromises, any agreement like that would not be agreed to by the Allies, like the US and the UK in particular. This was later confirmed, he said, by US Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who said that the objective of the US was always to weaken Russia. Still, as things stand at the end of 2023, much of the world is now asking for a diplomatic solution. They want the war to end, if not out of fear of nuclear war, but because people of the world have suffered economically. There's also been a growing skepticism among some nations about the possibility of a Ukrainian victory. In late 2023, left-wing Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico called for peace talks and announced his country's military aid to Ukraine was to stop. He shared some stern words not much heard in Western media, sounding a lot like Chomsky, Mearsheimer, and Ellsberg. He said, I am convinced that a large part of the European Union is deliberately living the war in Ukraine as a big lie. In fact, Ukraine is only being used for geopolitical purposes to weaken Russia economically and internationally. And it serves as a golden calf for the arms companies of the merchants of death. In the name of these geopolitical goals, I fear that the West will go to war with Russia to the last Ukrainian soldier, and we are not far from that goal. Of course, no one will openly admit to these immoral goals. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has also slammed the war, saying that the money the U.S. has spent on arming Ukraine would have been better spent on the region, North America. He said it was irrational, but we guess he wasn't thinking like a military strategist. Can you imagine what he and others would say if Ukraine joined NATO and all the Western powers were drawn into a potentially world-ending conflict? No one wants that. Most people are calling for diplomacy. Many of them see Ukraine in NATO as an impending disaster. At home inside the U.S., the New York Times in December said within the public sphere, support for the Ukraine war has been flagging, especially after what the Times called Ukraine's failed counteroffensive. Nonetheless, President Biden said, it's in our overwhelming national interest and international interest of all our friends. Any disruption in our ability to supply Ukraine clearly strengthens Putin's position. Even so, this kind of thinking has seen dwindling support. According to Gallup polls, in November 2023, 41% of Americans say the U.S. is doing too much to support Ukraine. and 64% of Americans say neither side is winning the war. 43% say the U.S. should help in the war quickly, even if that means ceding territory to Russia. Still, Gallup says there's a partisan divide in the U.S. More Republicans and independents want this war to end quickly, even if Ukraine doesn't get everything it wants, than Democrats, who in large numbers are still holding out for a full Ukrainian victory and getting back its lost territory. Also, many more Democrats than Republicans want Ukraine in NATO. How about libertarians? It seems they are, for the most part, against Ukraine joining NATO. In 2023, the libertarian think tank, the Cato Institute, condemned Putin for his unjustified attack, but called the conflict a U.S. proxy war. It wrote, "An open-ended conflict with steadily increasing entanglement against a nuclear-armed power with far more at stake is a bad deal for the American people. The Biden administration should engage in serious discussions with Moscow about ending the conflict and building a stable security structure. Will this happen next year, or will the U.S. double down on its support for the war?" As we've said, the U.S. has to think about China and the fact of what has been a unipolar world, meaning the U.S. as a sole superpower, could soon be turning into a multipolar world with China, not Russia, being U.S.'s major rival. It's no wonder the U.S. is hesitant to welcome Ukraine into NATO. Russia has already been considerably weakened. The job has been done with aplomb. The U.S. has been very successful, if you're skeptical enough to believe that this was always a proxy war. If the U.S. has to sink much more resources and, God forbid, manpower into Ukraine, it might start to look like China has the upper hand. Some pundits have said that China has been the biggest winner in the Ukraine war, since it's been able to sit back while the U.S. piles money into Europe. Ukraine in NATO would at the very least mean piling a lot more money into Europe. However, if Ukraine doesn't join NATO and the U.S. doesn't go to war in Europe, then the U.S. will come out of this in a strong position. Chomsky, in another interview, called Russia's invasion an act of brutal stupidity and said the invasion was an immense gift to the United States. He said it cost a fraction of the colossal U.S. military budget and has degraded a serious military competitor. He called the war a bargain for the U.S. On top of that, the invasion, he said, became a pretext for NATO to not only exist but expand. More and more critics like Chomsky have come out over the years as anti-NATO, with some calling it a tool of American imperialism. If that is true, Russia's invasion might have helped the imperialists. But there is the question, if the U.S. has already succeeded, why is it still talking about Ukraine in NATO? In 2023, the realist think tank, the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, said when the U.S. promises Ukraine will join NATO someday, that someday will never arrive, since the U.S. doesn't want World War III. The writer of the article said, "This begs the question, why continue to make a promise when there's no realistic path to achieving it? Why fight over a principle, NATO's open door, that's largely theoretical anyway, because Ukraine can't actually join the alliance without triggering the continent-wide conflagration NATO was established to avoid in the first place? Why carry on? Why not just focus on China? Russia's already too weak to control the rest of Europe," which was always what the U.S. has tried to prevent from happening under its global counter-hegemonic policy. Russia's GDP in 2022 was only slightly bigger than Italy's. It was less than France's and the UK's and well below Germany's. There will be no hegemon in Europe anytime soon. Russia doesn't have enough money, equipment, or manpower, certainly not now. An article in Geopolitical Monitor said, "Moscow's military campaign has not accomplished much so far, and the war has exposed that the Russian army is nothing more than a feeble shadow of the Soviet Red Army. The belief that Russia is a major military menace to Europe is fading. What it does have is those nukes, and written into its nuclear doctrine is that they can be used when there is aggression with conventional weapons against the Russian Federation when the very existence of the state is threatened. The doctrine also states that strikes may happen if there are attacks against critical governmental or military sites of the Russian Federation, disruption of which would undermine nuclear forces' response actions. If membership is not forthcoming, Ukraine will be given humanitarian and non-lethal aid, and there will be massive reconstruction projects under U.S. multinationals such as BlackRock and JP Morgan who will support the Ukraine Development Fund already in action. There is a hell of a lot of money to be made from Ukraine's recovery. It sounds cynical, but it's a fact of life, the way of war. The destruction of Ukraine, it's widely been reported, has led to record profits for the world's biggest arms industries, and after they're done tearing things down, lots of money will be made putting things back up. Already, the prospectors are talking about hundreds of billions of potential investments in tech, health, natural resources, and agriculture. In November 2023, Ukraine's investment promotion agency Ukraine Invest signed 2 memorandums announcing partnerships with Western investors. Some independent media is talking about US and Western European agribusiness firms already having bought up millions of hectares of Ukrainian farmland. At least 500 global businesses from 42 nations of the world have signed the Ukraine Business Compact. It said in a statement that it'll help realize Ukraine's huge potential. Ukraine doesn't need to be in NATO for any of this to happen. It's already happening. Western capital is pouring in. Let's just hope that soon the standard of living for Ukrainians, who've suffered so much, will vastly improve. There will be efforts to create better democratic institutions in the country too, that historically have been plagued by corruption and absolutely made life hard for the average Ukrainian person. With that, and a much improved military, Ukraine may become a better-looking nation, but that certainly doesn't mean that every single NATO member, as is needed, will sign the dotted line for Ukraine to join the NATO club. Importantly, as French President Emmanuel Macron called for, Ukraine will get compelling security assurances from the West. Macron won't be signing any dotted line anytime soon. He said in a speech that Ukraine will get the security assurances that goes with full-fledged membership to NATO, but he added such membership isn't accessible today. Now you know why, if you believe the skeptics. Now you need to watch how the Taliban became so powerful, or have a look at was President JFK really killed by the CIA?